Hey guys, welcome back. Thank you guys for being here. It's almost 5:30, but we still got about 5 minutes to go. So pretty much just hang in there, waiting for everyone to arrive. But good to see you guys. Nice to see you there in the chat. Anyone, feel free to say hi. Chime in whenever you want. Got a few more interesting essays to review today in our meeting, and I'm just chilling until 5:30. Hi, H, and all of you guys. Good to see you here. Hopefully you're having a good week. Nice first couple weeks of class. And yeah, this is my last meeting today, probably for a lot of you guys, since it's 5:30. It's the same for you, so I'm just going to get in this little philosophy lecture and then be on to the rest of your day. Hopefully it's good. Cool. Good evening. Welcome. Cool. Yeah, cats are running around. I know I saw some people asking about them, but they might pop in at any moment. But for now, it seems like they're kind of resting and relaxing. Hello, hello. Yep. Peachy, hey, Peach, come here, kitty. She's right there. She just walked up. I got two cats. Peachy, want to come say hi? Huh? Kitty? No? No, we'll see. She'll make her mind up. Good evening to one and all. Got about 3 minutes still, just to make sure everyone. I wonder if I should come give the announcement to our class, but I see the numbers are jumping up, so I'll probably be all right. Hello, Cameron, and all of you guys. Nice to see you. Hello, hello. Just a couple more minutes. Back. You guys ever try La Croix? It's pretty good. It's the limoncello flavor. Very refreshing. I'm a fan of sparkling. Hibiscus, yeah, I've tried that one. I like the coconut too. Yeah, I probably tried them all by now. But you gotta stay hydrated in these times we're living in, especially. All right. Let me. I'm gonna quickly send a note to the whole class just to make sure that they're all like we got good numbers, but just want to be on board with making sure everyone's got their announcements they need. So. 1 second, guys, while I get this little quick announcement out there. Okay, got it in there. All right, hey, so welcome back, everybody. Good to see you guys. And yeah, it's 5:30, so we're pretty much gonna get it going. Yeah, I hope you guys have been doing well, had a good weekend. And we're still continuing through these notes on the philosophy of religion. So I'm gonna first start off by kind of reminding you of the major topics that we covered last time, just going over them one more time, and then we'll just continue through the notes and try to stick with the schedule as much as we can. So like I said, good to see everybody there. Really happy that we're all here watching this virtually. And I hope you guys are just having a really good, successful first few weeks of class. All right, so the first topic in this philosophy class is philosophy of religion. And first of all, philosophy itself just refers to the love of wisdom. So going back thousands of years, people have been asking deep fundamental questions of interest to the human condition. What exists? What's the nature of reality? What are our moral obligations? Does God exist, right? So a lot of deep questions are pursued in philosophy for the sake of the love of wisdom itself. So in philosophy of religion, we examine these arguments for God's existence. We study the basis of religious belief and whatever the criticisms could be. The first major argument for God's existence that we are studying is the ontological argument from St. Anselm. So St. Anselm lived from 1033 to 1109, and he was the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was a well-known religious scholar and church leader. And basically, he wrote a book in 1077, which was called the Proslogion. In that book, he outlines an argument for God's existence. And the case for God's existence that he gives starts by talking about the nature of God and what God's believed to be. So he says, basically the idea of God can be summarized as the greatest conceivable being. There's a few different qualities of God that are often assumed to be associated with God, like, for example, being all-knowing, that's omniscient, being all-powerful, that's omnipotent, being perfectly, infinitely good, omnibenevolent, and being present everywhere all the time, that's omnipresent. But when you kind of distill those things down, what you get is the idea of the greatest conceivable being. So God is the greatest being, so says the author, that you could even conceive of or think of in your mind. As he puts it somewhat awkwardly, the being than which none greater can be conceived, right? So I got a question for you real fast. Who did he say had this idea of God in their mind? Like, what people have the idea of God as the definition, greatest conceivable being? Who did he say has this idea? Okay, theists, that's true. But it's beyond that, correct, Sierra? He says everybody. He says theists and even atheists too, at least this much can agree that the word God, just in terms of its definition, is the concept referring to the greatest conceivable being. So what he's saying is that even if you're an atheist, you understand what the word God means. You don't debate that that's the meaning of the term. So it's universally understood by all, in other words, that the idea of God is the idea of the greatest conceivable being. Now, the next thing he does is that he refers us to the idea that there are some things that only exist in the mind alone. And then there are things that exist in the mind and in reality also. Like, for example, what's something that only exists in the mind? Anything you can think of. But it's not real. Just something like a being or an object, but it's not a real thing. Yeah, unicorn is a fine example, leprechaun, tooth fairy, Bigfoot, Santa Claus, good examples, right? So those are things that exist, but not really in reality, only in your head, only in the mind. They're like fictional. But on the other hand, there are things that exist in the mind and in reality, like me or you or the device that you're watching this on, or the moon, or the sun, or the White House, or the Eiffel Tower, right? So those are things that are not just in your head. They really exist external to your mind in reality itself. Now, between things that exist only in the mind and things that exist in the mind but also extra in reality too, what kind of thing would be greater? So he claims it's greater to exist as which kind of thing? Only in the mind or in both? New question for you. Just let me see your answer. Both, right. So he's saying that it's greater to exist in both the mind and in reality than in only the mind. So what's his conclusion then? Since God is defined as what? The greatest conceivable being. And since it's greater to exist in the mind and in reality than it is to only exist in the mind, he thinks that like logically leads us to the conclusion that God must exist in both. Why? Because if he didn't really exist in both, then there would be something greater that we could imagine than God. But that's just impossible because, as we said at the beginning, the idea of God is the idea of the greatest conceivable being. Not just a great being, but something else could be even better. The greatest thing you could imagine. And so if you're thinking of God, but you think he's not real, that's inconsistent because as the greatest conceivable being, he must be perfect in every way, and not existing in reality would diminish that absolute perfection and greatness. So it's kind of like, because God is known in the mind as the greatest conceivable being, that is supposed to lead to the conclusion that he really exists, since if he didn't exist in the mind and reality, he would not be the greatest conceivable being, and then we would contradict ourselves. That would be like saying the greatest thing you could think of is actually not, which it does not make sense. Now, that's pretty much the major part of the argument. That's like the core of the argument, but there was a little bit more at the end that I talked to you about as well. So what does he add to that? He says after that, and this is a little bit sometimes tricky for you to state, but I hope maybe some of us can remember. Not only does he think that God has to actually exist in order to be the definition that we're talking about, greatest conceivable being. Furthermore, he says something extra. He says not only does he have to exist, but what? But also, beyond that, he can't even be thought not to exist. Yes, Brooklyn, good. You can't not think, well, that's actually one too many negatives. It's not possible to think he does not exist. So God cannot be thought to not exist. Why is that? Well, because according to Anselm's reasoning, things that can be considered not to exist or even imagined to not exist are less great than things which cannot be even thought of as not existing. So since God is the greatest conceivable being of all, he cannot be thought to not exist. If you could think of God not existing, then you would be thinking of something that's less than God, because God is just too great to even be imagined to be non-existent. Yeah? So that's like the last point. Well, there's this one more thing. He says, because God cannot be thought not to exist, what is his answer to the question? Well, then what is an atheist thinking? Atheists say, anyway, I don't think there's God. So Anselm says that's not even possible. There's no way for anybody to think there's no God. So what is Anselm's answer to like what's going on in the mind of an atheist or whoever? According to Anselm, they can't have the thought that they say they have God. So what does he say they are actually thinking? If you can remember that little piece of the discussion. That was very at the end of the meeting. Yeah, that they aren't really thinking of the real God, that they maybe use the word God, but the thing they're thinking of behind that word is not really the real thing. So that, he claims, is not really a real thought that God does not exist. It's a thought that something labeled God that could fail to exist. But since it's impossible to think of the real God that way, they must be mixed up, he thinks, about which being they're actually thinking of in their mind. Right? That's why he said here, and I'll just read it one last time. No one understanding what God is can think that God does not exist, even though he may say those words are no meaning, because God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Whoever really understands this understands clearly that this being exists such that not even in thought can it not exist. So whoever understands that God exists in this way cannot think of him as not existing. Okay, so that's just my quick summary of the last lecture. You know, we went into much more detail and depth, and we had a lot of notes, but I just wanted to kind of recap it. Now we're going to continue, and I need to talk to you next about what are different objections to Mr. Anselm's argument, right? And that's a feature of philosophy that's universal to the profession and to the discipline. People provide arguments both for and against any given position. So you heard an argument for God's existence, but it's not going to go without a challenge. So there's going to now be some critics and some counter arguments from them that we're going to have to learn about. So the first of the objections to Anselm's argument comes from this man. So his name is Gaunilo. So Gaunilo is a person who lived in roughly the same time period of Anselm, but not a lot is known about the specific dates of his life, except the fact that he wrote this paper about a year after the Proslogion was published. So he was, living in the time of Anselm, a literate individual who was actually a monk in the Christian church. What that tells you is that he also believes in God. But the problem he has is not with the idea that God exists. He agrees with that. Instead, he finds fault with the argument that Anselm gave to try and prove that God exists. So for Gaunilo anyway, that's a bad argument for God's existence, even though he agrees there is God. So in his view, you must believe in God on a different basis. At least this argument, he thinks, doesn't really make its case. So that's interesting, right? In many cases within philosophy, when you make a criticism of a person's position, you may not even really disagree with their conclusion. You may just find fault with the logic that they use to arrive at that conclusion. So anyway, Gaunilo, Christian monk of the 11th century, and he wrote this essay to criticize the ontological argument by Anselm, and it's called In Behalf of the Fool. In Behalf of the Fool. It's a somewhat clever title because he's taking up the position of the so-called fool, as Anselm refers to the atheist. So what he's basically saying is, I'm going to take up the position on behalf or in behalf of the so-called atheist to show that there's actually some reasonable basis for them to disagree with Anselm's argument. Okay, now the first thing that he actually does as he starts this piece is that he sort of summarizes Anselm's argument just one time so that the reader of his article will understand what it is that he's criticizing. Okay, so we all should understand that that first paragraph then on page 17 in his essay is not him putting forward the argument on his own, but rather saying, here is what Anselm argued in the Proslogion. And then after that, he says, now I'm going to show you what's wrong with it. But I kind of think that his summary of Anselm's argument is very clear and well stated. So now that we've learned the argument, I'm going to sort of read you Gaunilo's summary of it, and you'll see how he puts it. So he says it this way. To anybody doubting whether there is or denying that there is something of such a nature than which nothing greater can be thought, so in translation, to anybody who doubts that there's God, it is said in the Proslogion that his existence is proven first, and now he goes into the argument. They say it's proven because the very one who denies or doubts it already has it in his mind, since when he hears it spoken of, he understands what is said. And further, because what he understands is necessarily such that it exists not only in his mind, but also in reality. And this is proved by the fact that it is greater to exist both in the mind and in reality than in the mind alone. Because if this being exists in the mind alone, anything that existed in reality would be greater than this being, and thus that which is greater than everything would be less than something and would not be greater than everything, which is obviously a contradiction. So therefore, it is necessarily the case that that which is greater than everything, being already proven to exist in the mind, should exist not only in the mind, but also in reality, since otherwise it would not be greater than everything. Okay, so that's his, I think, very clear and, in a way, blunt, brief recap of the argument. If God, according to the argument, wasn't in reality, then he wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being, but that doesn't make sense because everyone knows that that definition of God is greatest conceivable being. Okay, but then as he goes on, he says, but the fool can reply, that this thing is said already to exist in the mind only in the sense that I understand what is said. And then he goes into his example. So now, basically, Gaunilo's counter-argument here crucially relies on the use of a counter-example to Anselm's argument. He uses an argument by means of analogy. So what he asks us to think about next is a hypothetical scenario. In philosophy, as you guys are going to learn, there's a lot of use of what are called hypothetical scenarios. Sometimes they're labeled thought experiments. They just ask you to imagine a somewhat fictional scenario in order for you to focus your mind on certain given concepts in the presentation of an argument. So you're not supposed to worry exactly too much that these hypothetical scenarios are unrealistic or that they are detached from reality, because the point of them is not to present something realistic. The point is rather to get your mind to focus on a specific theoretical issue in an argument, okay? So here's the hypothetical scenario given to us by Gaunilo. It's an example involving what he calls the lost island, okay? Now, what is this lost island? Basically, he's talking about an island, and he says, think of this as the greatest conceivable island, okay? Greatest conceivable island. So what you want to think of in your mind right now is this idea of an island that is great, but it's not just sort of great or mostly great. It's the greatest island you could possibly think of ever. So whatever it is that makes islands, great, this has that and more to the absolute maximum. So, perfect beaches, perfect weather, perfect, attractions and amenities and all the rest. So if you were on this island, it's like a paradise pretty much. It's the greatest conceivable island. What is it? It's the lost island. Would it be sort of like some heavenly thing? I mean, basically, yeah, it's abundant in resources. It's lovely to be there. I don't know, fill in the blank with your imagination, but it's a great island, and it's the greatest island you could possibly imagine, okay? So here's what he says about it. He says, for example, they say that there is in the ocean somewhere an island, which because of the difficulty of finding that which does not exist, some have called the lost island. And the story goes that it is blessed with all manner of priceless riches and delights in abundance. More than the Happy Isles, having no owner or inhabitant, it is superior everywhere in abundance of riches to all the other lands that men inhabit. Okay. So where he's going next with this is basically he's trying to turn the tables on Anselm's argument by creating an example which will kind of fit the same format of his argument, but which we will see leads us to a ridiculous conclusion, okay? So if this island is the greatest conceivable island, then Gaunilo points out that according to Anselm's own logic, we should have to say what about this island? If it's the greatest conceivable island, the lost island, then, Anselm's view, according to Gaunilo, would be that this island has to what? If it's the greatest conceivable island, part of it being the greatest thing that you could conceive of would be that it would have to what? Following, along from the previous argument about God, yeah, that it would have to actually exist in reality. Gabriel, you say, is he using Anselm's argument against him? Well, what he's kind of doing is reductio ad absurdum, which was the same tactic used by Anselm himself. So I don't know, it's not that he's using the argument against him per se, but in a way he is. He's because we can use that identical logic towards a clearly false conclusion, right? So taking stock of the bigger picture. Gaunilo says Anselm thinks he proves God exists because he's known as the greatest conceivable being. And part of that greatness would be you'd have to really exist in reality, not just the mind. But now he says, but think about it. If I give you an example of, let's suppose, the greatest conceivable island, then the same logic would dictate that that island must actually exist because If it didn't really exist in reality, then it wouldn't be the greatest thing that you could conceive of, or there would be an island that would be greater, like a real island, you know? So the logic of Anselm seems to imply that the island is real. But what can we say with total confidence about this supposed lost island? Despite the logic of Anselm, which would seem to conclude that this island must actually exist, we all know full well that what? Despite the force of the argument given here, it's clear to us all that in fact what? That's where I just want to see what you can tell me next. Even though the argument of Anselm would seem to indicate that this island really exists due to its being defined as the greatest, yes, guys, that we know in fact there is no such island. So what he's saying is, if we really thought Anselm's argument seriously proved what it set out to prove, then we could use that same methodology of argument to make a proof or attempt to prove the existence of things that we just know are not real. Like I could sit here and tell you, think in your mind of the greatest conceivable movie, a movie so good that there could never be a better movie, the best movie that any mind could ever think of. Okay, so part of that greatness is that it has to really exist. Shrek, nice one, sure, you know, whatever. But point is, right, that there's no such thing, even though we have like some ideal concept perhaps in the mind of it. So just having an idea of a greatest possible or conceivable such and such does not really imply that there really is such a thing. If it did, then we would be able to prove, so to speak, the existence of things that we know don't really exist. The greatest conceivable hamburger has to be real, just because if it wasn't, it would not be as great as one that did in fact exist in reality. So that's the problem here. The argument in a way proves too much. It may be an attempt to prove the existence of God, but along with that same logic, one could try to illegitimately prove the existence of anything whatsoever as long as they affixed the label greatest conceivable to the front of it. So he's basically saying you can't prove something is real in reality starting off with just the idea of something perfect in your mind. So from the idea of a greatest conceivable whatever, it does not follow that it really exists. Because if that did, you know, actually prove that, then it should work with the island as well. But we know that's not true. So his reductio is basically like this. Anselm's argument doesn't work, but let's assume for the sake of the argument that it does. If his argument successfully proved the existence of God, then it would also be capable of proving the existence of these islands and so on, but that's ridiculous and absurd. So, therefore, the original assumption is true, that he's not actually proven the existence of God. So that's kind of the logic that's been exposed to be faulty, or at least Gamillo would say it's faulty. Does that make sense to you guys? So he's creating like a parody, in a way, of Anselm's argument. He says, well, you're proving God exists because of the idea of greatest conceivable being, and the further assumption that greatness implies that you are real. Well, how about I can now produce an argument which is very close to yours, with the only difference being that I substitute island for God. And in this case, he hopes that the reader will conclude that there's obviously no such island, so any type of argument that would lead us to that result has to itself be a fallacious argument. So I'm looking at some of the comments. Was Gamillo a believer in God? Good question. And as I said, yes, Gamillo did believe in God. But the basis for his belief in God has nothing to do with Anselm's argument. I'm sure that for him, the basis for his belief is just practice within his religious tradition, reading of scripture, faith, you know, but whatever the justification or reasons for Gamillo to believe in God may be, they have nothing to do with the argument of Anselm. So they're allies, and they share the opinion that God exists in that sense. But they have got a completely different approach to trying to make the case for the existence of God. Gamillo here doesn't say anything about why he believes in God. He just calls out and criticizes Mr. Anselm's attempt to make the proof in this way. But you're just learning something, that people can agree with a conclusion even if they arrive at the conclusion in different ways. So I might not like someone else's reasons for arriving at a conclusion, even if I do myself agree with the claim they arrived at. Yeah, so you could say that he flipped his thinking back onto him, or that he tried to turn the tables, as I sometimes say, like, let's take your argument as though it works. If so, what do you say to the island example, which is ridiculous? Okay, and let me just read on from that a little more, so I can finish with the rest of whatever Gaunilo says. Very short passage. So he says, now if anyone, I'll just say it again. For example, they say there's an ocean somewhere, that they say that there is in the ocean somewhere an island, which because of the difficulty of finding that which does not exist, some have called the Lost Island. The story goes that it is blessed with all manner of priceless riches and delights in abundance, more than the Happy Isles even, and having no owner or inhabitant, it is superior everywhere in abundance to all the other lands that men inhabit. Now, if anyone tells me that it is like this, I should easily understand what is said, since nothing is difficult about that. But, now here he really goes on the offense. He says, but if he should then go on to say, as though it were just a logical result, that you cannot anymore doubt that this island that is more excellent than all other lands truly exists somewhere in reality, then you can doubt that it is in your mind. And since it is more excellent to exist not only in the mind, but also in reality, therefore it must exist. Because if it didn't exist, anything existing in reality would be more excellent than it. And so this island, already conceived of by you to be more excellent than others, will not be more excellent. He says, if somebody tries thus to persuade me that this island really exists beyond all doubt, I would either think that he was joking, or I would find it hard to decide which of us I should judge to be the bigger fool, me, if I agree with him, or he, if he thinks that he's proving the existence of the island with any certainty in this way. Thus, first of all, might the fool reply to objections. That's how he says the atheist might reply back to Anselm's argument. And if someone should then assert that this greater than everything is such that it cannot be thought not to exist, then he could make the same reply and say, when have I said that there truly existed some being that is greater than everything, such that from this it could be proved to me that the same being really existed, to such a degree that it could not be thought not to. That is why it must first be proved conclusively by argument that there is some higher nature which is greater and better than all things, so that from this we can also infer everything else. So there he kind of rests his case against Anselm. All right, so far as we've been following along, we've learned about Gaunilo's counter-argument and, of course, the classic argument from Anselm himself, the ontological argument. When we study these arguments and objections, you, the student, and just anybody, will make their own judgments. You may be in the position thinking, well, I thought that Anselm made a clear and compelling case for God's existence. I followed his logic and I thought it was reasonable. Or you might say that you found the critic or the objection to be more solid, and therefore you have your doubts about the effectiveness of the argument. Wherever you stand, though, we're just giving you the intellectual options to debate and consider. So that's one objection to Anselm, right? But there's a few others that we also now have to talk about. So we're going to segue into the next objection to Anselm. And when we finish with these, there's a trio of objections. Then we're going to move to the next major argument for God's existence. So it's not just going to stop with Anselm. There's a few more looks at trying to prove God exists that are different. But we're still focused for the moment on objections to Anselm. Okay, so I'm moving from Gaunilo next to this man whose name is G.E. Moore. And as always, feel free if there's questions you have, comments, or anything else, let me know in the chat, and I'll see those. Okay, so what's next then is the writing of philosopher G.E. Moore. This is taking us forward in time quite a bit. It's taking us out there 1,000 years or 900 basically years into the 20th century. So here's a guy, G. And when did he leave? What are his dates? He lived from 1873 to 1958. And in 1935, he wrote and presented this paper at a conference that we're now going to learn about. It's called, Is Existence a Predicate? So what I'm doing is I'm just putting up on the board here the title, date, and author information for this little piece of our class. Is existence a predicate? That's the title. And he's another critic of the ontological argument. He's got an objection, which is different in nature from Gaunilo's, but it's trying to get to the same result, that this is a problematic argument and it doesn't actually have the ability to prove God exists. So as the title will seem to reveal, the major point made in this paper is that existence is not a predicate, and he thinks that's the problem with the ontological argument. But for us to comprehend that, we all have to think and know about what does the word predicate mean. Okay, so a predicate is sort of a fancy philosophy or grammar word that has to do with an attribute of something. Okay, so let me make that clear and put it here. Predicate. It is an attribute, feature, or quality of something. So predicate is basically an attribute of a thing. In every single grammatical English sentence or of any language, there's a subject and a predicate structure. The subject of a sentence is the object referred to in the sentence, and the predicate of the sentence is the feature, the attribute that is associated with the subject. As we say, that is predicated of the subject. So just to see if you can follow that, let me ask a basic question. Suppose someone states that the dog is brown. Okay? Let's see if you can follow me. In that sentence, the dog is brown, what do you believe would be the subject of the sentence? Dog is brown. What's the subject in that example? Let's see. Put it in the chat. Exhausted? Really, AJ? But anyway, yeah, the dog. The dog is brown. The dog is the subject of the sentence. Okay? And what is the predicate, you believe, of that same sentence? Now, not to worry, AJ, it's funny, but anyway, that's good. Yeah, no, the predicate. The predicate, so the subject is the dog, correct. I say dog is brown. What's the predicate of the sentence? It's the feature of being brown, right? It's the attribute of being brown. So being brown is attributed to the dog, or predicated of the dog. If I tell you that I'm exhausted, then I am the subject of the sentence, and being exhausted is the quality or feature, the predicate that I claim to have at that particular time, okay? So whenever you say any sentence, there's a combination of subject and predicate, you know, like a noun and a verb or something. A predicate can be a verb, an adjective. It's just anything that is attributed to a subject in a full sentence, okay? So what he's saying then in this argument, in this paper overall, is that the concept of existing is not an attribute of a thing. And that's why he thinks Anselm's argument fails. Because as he sees it, here's the way that Anselm argued. Anselm says the definition of God is greatest conceivable being. Greatest being you could ever think of. Based on that definition alone, he says that God has to exist, because a part of being perfect and great is to have every quality that makes a thing perfect or great. You can't even be missing one of them. So if power and knowledge, goodness are good qualities, then he has them to an infinite maximum degree. But they say on top of that, that if he didn't exist, then he would be missing one attribute that needs to be there for you to be utterly perfect. So he has that quality too. But now G.E. Moore enters the scene like 1,000 years later, and he says, wait a minute though, hold up. Existing is not an attribute though. So the whole argument is misconceived. It treats the concept of existence as though it's a feature of something, a feature that you cannot lack if you're going to be absolutely great and greater than anything else. But Moore says, not so fast. When you analyze it logically, you come to see that the concept of existence is not really an attribute at all. It's not a feature or quality of anything. And so it's a logically confused argument to say that if a being was really perfect, he would have to have that attribute. Because when you break it down, you'll see that existence is not an attribute, okay? Now, the example that G.E. Moore gives to try and prove to the reader, to all of us, I guess, that existence is not an attribute, that it's not a predicate in his terminology. The example that he gives is a little weird and it's kind of a little complex, but it's not too bad once I help you understand it. Before I jump right into it and break it down, though, I kind of wanted to give you a different way of thinking about it, just off of the level of common sense. Okay, so predicates are attributes of things, the sort of things that you would say if you were ever going to describe some object or something. But think about situations where you actually give a description of something. Okay, so like, here's a case that I can think of. You're going to sell something online. Suppose that you're trying to put up your car, and list it for sale. So you go on Craigslist, wherever, and you want to tell people what the car's like. You can't just be like, car for sale. You have to give at least a basic description of it, okay? So what kind of things would you say about a car that you're putting up for sale? Normal things. You'd say like, okay, its color, its year, its make, model, whatever, if it has a sunroof, if it has power locks, you're going to give the description of its attributes, what it's like. But here would be a really bizarre advertisement, okay? You're reading through it, it says car, $3,000 or best offer, drop top, 64 Chevy Impala, and it's blue. It's got an 8-cylinder engine, and it exists. That's one of its cool features. It's got 4 doors. Now, which one of those things is not like the others? One of them's not like the others. The description of the object kind of got a little bit weird when we mentioned what thing about it. That it exists, right? So that kind of stands out as an odd and inappropriate thing to say about something that you're describing. Existence is sort of assumed when you're describing the object. It's sort of a precondition for something to even have attributes in the first place. So just because we can grammatically use it as a predicate does not mean that logically speaking it's a description of anything. Here's another case. In Alexandra, I don't know if it was a shocking thing I was saying or whatever, but yeah, another example could be when you describe yourself, as you do a lot of times. You put up a little blurb about yourself in a bio on social media or something. Or in class introductions, you're telling people, oh, I'm an athlete, or I'm a musician, or I really love to hike. No, not to worry. I'm just playing around. But anyway, yeah. So in case like you describe yourself, you'd never add to that description, I like long walks, and I love to read. I exist, which is one of my cool features too. In high school, I was on track and field. To say that you exist is not normal in the way of describing the attributes of the thing. Okay, so I'm just telling you that common sense, based on those examples, does kind of reveal to you that existence is not really a description of something. But we have to contend and deal with the actual example used by the author. So what I gave you just now was like me speaking to you off a level of everyday common sense. When you describe things, it would never even enter your mind to mention whether the thing exists or not in the way of describing it. But he goes about making the point here slightly differently. So let's try and get it. So, yeah. All right. So he says this: you will see that existence is not a real predicate if you compare sentences which do have a predicate in them with sentences which substitute that predicate with the term exists. he believes that what you're going to see now is that when we swap out the predicate in the sentence with the word exists, it transforms it from a sentence that makes reasonable sense into a sentence that is just incomprehensible and meaningless. Okay? So he says, let's look at 3 sentences here. And they all have to do with the randomly chosen statement, tigers growl. Okay? So, tigers growl. He says, with tigers growl, it can be divided down into 3 possible variations using the prefix some, most, or all. So here, look at these 3 sentences. Some tigers growl. Most tigers growl. And then third, all tigers growl. Now, all that we are pointing out here about this trio of statements on the board is that all of them make clear sense. They all make reasonable sense. For example, I believe all of us could point out and easily identify what would have to be true for these statements to be true. Like, for example, some tigers growl. The statement some tigers growl is true if what? How many for this one to be true? There just has to be what? If some tigers growl. It's different than saying most or all. That's all I'm saying. So there has to be just at least one. If there's one tiger at least somewhere out there that growls, then that makes this true. Because it doesn't say all, and it doesn't even say most. It just says some. And at a minimum, at least one. The only thing that would make this false is if there are no tigers that growl. So if there's at least one, that's true. Okay, now let's move to the next case. Most tigers growl. If that's true, then how many of the tigers would have to growl exactly? More than half. If it was less than half, then it wouldn't be most, just mathematically. And if it was exactly half, then it would be a 50-50, so it wouldn't be most. So there has to be at least one more than half for this to be true. More than half of them growl, then most of them growl. And of course, for all tigers growl to be true, that's pretty straightforward. That means that every single tiger growls. And there's not even one tiger that does not. Okay, yeah, so like as you're saying, Cameron, this is majority, this is at least one, and this is 100%. But now, okay, I need you guys to take this little leap with me as we convert these sentences into 3 new sentences. And the change that we're going to make is we're simply going to erase the predicate growl and replace it with exists. And he's going to show us that when we do that, 2 of the 3 just no longer make any sense at all. Okay? Okay. So now we've got, in replacing the predicate with the term exists, we've turned 2 of these sentences into gibberish, pretty much. So let's think about most tigers exist for a moment. Most tigers exist. If it was to be modeled on the understanding of most tigers growl, then what did we say? That would imply that more than half of the tigers, what? The majority of the tigers, according to this sentence, do what? Looking at most tigers exist here. So that's, as we can clearly say, I hope, it's the statement that the majority of them, remind me, exist. Yes. But think about the second part of that analysis. The majority of them exist, and a smaller number of them, the minority, don't exist. But right now, you should scratch your head and say, what? Because that doesn't make sense. You cannot compare the quantity of existing things with the quantity of non-existing things, because things that don't exist don't have quantities. You understand? So it's not like you can say, well, out of 100 tigers, 51 exist and 49 of them don't. Things that don't exist cannot be numbered and enumerated. Look around you in the room that you're in right now. How many non-existent tigers are there right now? Is it one? Is it a million? It makes no sense to ask that question. The only things that can be numbered and counted are things that do exist. So by using existence to replace a predicate, we've turned this sentence into something that really makes just no logical sense. Now, with real predicates, there's no such confusion. Because if I say most tigers growl, that means there's a set of tigers, all of which exist. And the larger share of them growl, and the smaller share of them don't. But the smaller number of them, the minority, that don't, let's say, growl, can still be counted because those are just tigers that lack one feature of growling. But it makes no sense to talk about tigers or anything else that lack the feature of existing itself, right? So this has become meaningless nonsense. When we switched out the predicate growl with the term exists, we, in terms of doing that substitution, created a statement that doesn't make any kind of real sense logically. Same with all tigers exist, okay? So when we stated all tigers growl, that was defined or interpreted as every tiger growls, and there is no tiger that doesn't growl. But if that was going to be applied to this statement, what we would be saying is that every tiger exists, and there is no tiger that does not exist. But we can't comprehend that without having an understanding of what a non-existent tiger would be. Non-existent object is like a oxymoron. If a thing doesn't exist, then it's not an object. So there's no way of talking about the quantity 0, 1, or any number of non-existing things. So all tigers exist is also just as much meaningless or absurd as most tigers exist. Now, of the three, the author Moore says, look, this top one, some tigers exist. It's the only one of the three that can be interpreted to make some sense. Because some tigers exist does not require any comparative between the set of existing and non-existing tigers. This only states or implies that there is at least one tiger, which is not itself problematic as a sentence. But the other two definitely are. So what we've learned then is that existence is not a predicate, because if it was, then you could replace it with any other predicate and it would still make sense. But when we replace a predicate with exists, we get at least 2 out of 3 sentences that make no sense. To even deepen the lesson and reinforce what he's saying, he also calls our attention to the negative form of these expressions. So take the statement, some tigers do not growl. That's easy to understand, right? It's just saying that there's at least one tiger out there, for whatever reason, that doesn't growl and doesn't have that attribute. But what would be the corollary using the word exists? It would be this sentence. Some tigers do not exist. So these are all just weird. Like, some tigers do not exist. What is even being said? If you find yourself looking at this and just kind of being confused, then ironically you're getting it. Because it's supposed to be, as the author argues, just gibberish. Some tigers do not exist is like saying there's some things that are not things. That does not make sense. We're not talking about tigers that are deceased or something like that. We're talking about like beings that have no existence at all, which is just completely contradictory and internally inconsistent. So if a real predicate had been used to swap out for growls, like any predicate at all, happy, then there would have been no problem, at least in terms of the meaning of the sentences. Some tigers are happy, most of them are, all of them are, some tigers aren't happy. The things that don't have the so-called attribute cannot possibly be comprehended in the same way that things which lack some normal attribute still exist. Take, for example, all of us watching this video lecture right now. Suppose I say that most of us are not wearing glasses. That's something that's easy to understand, because like looking at the numbers, there's 43 of us here. So that would mean that like at least 22 of us are not wearing glasses. The remaining number of people, though, are existing beings. They just don't have an attribute. But I couldn't say most of us exist in this meeting, because to enumerate the number of us that don't exist makes no sense. So what, 43 of us are watching this that exist, and then there's 44 or 50 of us that don't exist that are in attendance? That's just absurd. So this is his kind of highly linguistic way of trying to make the common sense point that existence should not be thought of as any type of attribute. And so then returning to the larger scope of the back and forth between Anselm and Moore, let's take stock. Anselm came out in 1077 and he said, hey guys, here's a proof that God exists. And it's just based on ideas alone. It's just based on the idea of God being the greatest conceivable being. If you agree with that definition, then you can't deny that he exists, because a part of being absolutely perfect and great is existence. That's one of the features. That's one of the predicates that a perfect being has to have. So he's got that one too, so he's real. Okay, and then Moore says there's problems here, because when you make the argument, it's as though you think existence is just an attribute like any other attribute. But it's not even an attribute. And you can see that when you try and use it in the way that an attribute would have been used. You expose how it fails to function as a typical predicate because of the breakdown in logical meaningfulness of sentences which exhibit this term as a substitute for a real predicate. Okay, now let me read a bit from his words, which I tried my best to bring down to earth for you, because sometimes the philosophers themselves can speak in a confusing way, which is a fair point. So he says here, let's find the right passage that I want to use. Okay, I think that this is on page 20 on the left. He says, I think this can be made clear by comparing the expressions, some tigers don't growl, and some tigers don't exist. The first one, some tigers don't growl, whether it's true or false, has a perfectly clear meaning. Like, you understand what it means. A meaning just as clear as some tigers do growl. And it's perfectly clear that both could be true together. But with some tigers don't exist, the case is different. Some tigers exist has a clear meaning. It just means there are some tigers. But the meaning of some tigers don't exist, if any, is certainly not clear. It is a queer and puzzling expression. Does it have any meaning at all? And if so, what meaning? If it has any, it would appear that it must mean the same as there are some tigers which don't exist. But what does this mean? Is it possible that there should be any things that don't exist? I think the answer is that if in the sentence some tigers don't exist, you are using exist with the same meaning as in some tigers do exist, then the former sentence as a whole has no meaning at all. It is pure nonsense. And continuing on, he says, if this is so, it will follow that all tigers exist and most tigers exist also have no meaning at all. Because all tigers growl is equivalent to the conjunction some tigers growl and there is no tiger which does not growl. And this has a meaning, because there is at least one tiger which does not growl has a meaning. If, therefore, there is at least one tiger which does not exist has no meaning, it will follow that all tigers exist also has none. And let me see if I can find another quick passage to just clarify it. Yeah, okay, he says at the top of 20 on the left, I hope it will strike everyone that there is something very strange about the statement most tigers exist. It seems to imply all tigers and most tigers exist. It seems to imply that all tigers exist and most tigers exist have a clear meaning, just as all tigers growl and most tigers growl do. And that it is just an accident that we do not happen ever to use tigers exist to express either of those two meanings. But I'm trying to find the passage here, sorry. Whereas we do sometimes use tigers growl to mean all tigers growl or most tigers growl instead of merely some. But is this in fact the case? Have all tigers exist and most tigers exist any meaning at all? Certainly they do not have a clear meaning, as all tigers growl and most tigers growl. They are puzzling expressions which do not carry their meaning if they have any on the face of them. That this is so indicates that there is some important difference between the use of exist and the use of real predicates like growl or scratch. Yeah, so there you have it. Now, I want to make one point about his writing. If you read through the essay, which of course you always should, you'll notice that he does attach the word tame to his discussion. Some tame tigers exist. Most tame tigers exist. You'll note that I've omitted the word tame in my lesson today because it's actually just confusing to the student and it doesn't add to the larger point that he is making. Because tame is itself a second predicate, so I thought it would be streamlined and simplified a bit if we just deleted that from my teaching of it here. So as you read through the article, never mind the term tame, that's doing no work. It's just his discussion of how exists cannot reasonably be substituted for growls and still carry through with a coherent meaning. Okay? All right. So I'm going to erase this, and we have yet to reveal a little bit of material on one more author on this. Give me a second, though, because I have to go and get my MacBook charger. It's down to like 10%, so I don't want to take a chance on that. Okay. So last little note on this G.E. Moore, just to kind of make sure that it sinks in as much as possible. I want to try and visually display the difference between making a claim involving the words most and some predicate, and then using the words most and exist instead. So suppose we had like a classroom like back in the day, and in the classroom you have 5 people. Okay, so like let's just say this is 2 men and 3 women, okay? In that class you could say most of the students are women because it's 3 against 2. So as dividing it that way, there's a larger number of females than males. Makes sense. The predicate here is being female. Most of these students are female. But if I say in another case, most of the students exist. Huh? How can I divide up things such that I show you visually an analog to the case here? Most of the students exist. Well, there's 5 students, so they all exist. There's more of them that exist than don't exist, but there's no such thing as a non-existent person. So there's no number we can compare against 5 here. We can't say, oh, there's 1 non-existent person in the room, or there's 2, or there's 10, or there's 100. So when you don't have 2 different existing quantities of things to compare, it makes no sense to talk about the relative amounts, some, most, or all. Only when it is a given that all the things exist can we divide them in such a way that we can see which one of the existing things has a feature and which of the existing things fail to have that feature. So in the bigger picture of the argument, Anselm tried to say that existence is something that a perfect being will not lack, because if you're really the greatest of all, you're going to have all the best features, existence being one of them. And then Anselm, he thinks about it and he says, but there's a problem right there because existence is not really an attribute in the first place. And he tries to show that by means of these examples, the linguistic comparative between the 3 sets of sentences. I also tried to make the point to you in a slightly less formal way, just by talking about how if you were going to describe anything, it would never even come across your mind in a normal circumstance to mention its existence, because that's just, of course, assumed. Otherwise, there's nothing to describe. Okay. The ontological argument, and maybe this will bridge the divide between today and Thursday. We might have a little more on this to still cover when we pick up on Thursday. But at any rate, we're going to get started with him. So one more major critic of Anselm is William Rowe. Okay, William Rowe. And He's still a living philosopher. Well, he was a philosopher until he retired in 2005 at Purdue University. In 1993, he wrote this paper that we're going to look at, and it's called "Why the Ontological Argument Fails." I'm just providing, again, the author, the date, and the title of this essay that he wrote. So yeah, why the ontological argument fails? As you can see from the title, it's a pretty clear and straightforward title. He thinks this is a failed argument, but he wants to try and point out for us why. What's wrong with the argument? Why doesn't it succeed? Why doesn't it, actually, he thinks, prove that God exists? Okay, so I'm going to talk about this, though, but I just remember one last thing I wanted to say about Moore. Let me just throw this out there. It's not the biggest part of the essay. We've covered it now, so it's all in your mind, but I wanted to throw in one last point. Moore, at the end, he says, okay, if you really wanted to try and bend over backwards and stretch things to try and give some kind of meaningfulness to those sentences about, most tigers exist or some tigers don't exist, the best you could do, the closest you could come to making those make sense is to say that when you speak of the non-existent tigers, you're talking about tigers that are imaginary or creatures from fiction. And in fact, there are a few of those. Have you guys ever heard of Calvin and Hobbes? I believe, I'm not sure which one is which, but maybe Hobbes is the tiger that, follows Calvin around in those comic strips. Winnie the Pooh, Tigger is in there, and he's like a friend of Winnie the Pooh, and he's like a fictional tiger. Tony the Tiger. Anyone ever have Frosted Flakes? The mascot of Frosted Flakes. He's a cartoon tiger. So there's 3 non-existent tigers. Maybe when a person says most tigers exist, they mean most tigers are flesh and blood. And then there's like a small number of them that are just like made up creatures from like movies and cartoons and stuff. What he says about that is, if that is your best way of trying to like force those exists sentences to have meaning, it's still really weird and unconventional. And nothing like a detour into the realm of fiction and fictional objects is required to make sense of the everyday statement, most tigers growl. So most tigers exist, etc., is either meaningless completely or only meaningful if we make very weird attempts to assign it meaning by talking about fictional objects. But this still shows us that existence is not an everyday predicate, because when it's used in a sentence, it makes it either meaningless or only meaningful according to a very weird interpretation that we don't have to use in an ordinary predicates case. Okay, so that was my little thing about Tony the Tiger and all those guys. So back now to William Rowe. Why the ontological argument fails. Okay, so his basic complaint about the argument, I shouldn't call it a complaint because it's a reasonable objection, but his problem with it is that from analyzing an idea of something, you can never prove that something exists in reality. He says you can never get from I'm thinking of ideas to a proof that something in the mind exists external to the mind. His specific detailed point to make that case is that he thinks the ontological argument is simply trying to define God into existence. Like it's just saying, I define God as existing, and you can't say that he doesn't exist because it's in the definition. But proving that something exists in reality is not the same as just saying that according to my definition of a word, it exists. So he basically thinks the argument is kind of like clever wordplay. It tries to trap you within the logic of the definition. It sets forth a definition of God which says, in the definition, he exists. So if you deny that he exists, it's like you're contradicting the meaning of the word. But according to Rowe, that's problematic. You can't just say, based on the meaning of this definition, I have proof that something is real. Now, he has an example that he utilizes to try and present this point. The example is a little funny, it's a little weird, but we got to deal with it. It's an example that asks us to consider 2 different groups of magicians. He invents 2 words, okay, for the purposes of the argument. These two words are just made up, but they have stipulated definitions, and they refer to magicians of a kind. So here are two words. I'm going to erase this so I can put that on the board. Okay, so consider these two words here. First of all, I've got the word magician. Okay, and then over here to the right, magico. Now, I want you to know that this is not a misspelling. The real word magician has an I after the C, like this. But magician doesn't have that I. Okay, so it's not said magician, it's magician, and this is magico. Now, what is a magician? Okay, so here's the definition that he provides. It is simply just a word that means an existing magician. And what is a magico? As you might guess, it's a made-up word, but it means non-existing magician. All right. Now, to sort of help advance this argument, I would ask some of us to give a few examples of each. So let's start on this side. I want you to think through in your mind of famous people that you've heard of who practice magic tricks for a living. We're talking about professional magicians. There have definitely been some. There are some out there today. Who knows the name of any, we're talking real life flesh and blood performers of magic tricks? Who could be some names? I'm going to put them up here. David Blaine, okay, good. He does a lot of those like escape artist type tricks where he confines himself to a box or something. So a lot of people give him. Chris Angel, is it K or C? I can't remember, but whatever the way you spell it. Chris Angel, the so-called mind freak. Yeah, he's got like a residency in Vegas, or he did. I don't know if it's probably no one there anymore. But yeah, he's another one. Houdini, the world famous Houdini, Harry Houdini. You guys ever hear about how Houdini died? He actually died while he was performing some type of trick. It seems to me, though, that it wasn't his best work. He said, "I could take any punch. Come up here and somebody hit me in the stomach. I have such fortitude that I could take any blow." And the basic trick was, yeah, he was supposed to like brace his stomach and tense up the muscles tight so that he could handle the punch. But basically, the guy hit him before he was ready for that. So internal bleeding, and he died from that. But anyway, not relevant to the lesson. Penn and Teller, sure. Neil Patrick Harris, he's a comedian. Maybe he's done some tricks. But like at any rate, guys, we can understand the idea here. There's further names to be added, but let's just keep it to a few. Now, how about over here? I want you to think with me of fictional magicians, not real people, like made up individuals from movies, films, cartoons, whatever. Harry Potter, okay, good. No, that's just a fictional character, not a real human being that ever lived. What are some others for the non-existing side? Gandalf Grey from, Lord of the Rings. Kind of like a wizard, but yeah, it's the same, The Wizards of Waverly Place. Perhaps Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange, isn't he like in the X-Men universe, though? But, he's got some powers, I guess, call him magic or whatever. Merlin, that's a famous one from, old literature and Knights of the Round Table, not a real person. Okay, so, add to your own list, if you like, other of your favorite examples. But now, all I'm trying to tell you is this. By term magician, or magico, we refer to non-existing magicians like that. Okay, now, here's the thing. AJ is funny. Here's the thing. I want you to next imagine counterfactual timeline of world history. Okay, so we're in our timeline. And it's pretty good, I guess, except for the coronavirus. But anyway, imagine a different one, though, with the only main difference that magicians never actually really existed. Can you imagine that? Like, I'm asking you to suppose, for the sake of like imagination, that we never ever had people do magic tricks. Maybe it was considered a taboo. Maybe for whatever reason people just never thought of doing it. But like, imagine that possible world in your mind right now. Okay? Now suppose that in that possible world a person had defined this term, magic hand, and they said what it means is existing magician. Would making that word up cause magicians to necessarily exist in that counterfactual? Would we have to have magicians just because we invented the word? Yes or no? Suppose we lived in a world where there were no people like David Blaine, Chris Angel, and Houdini. But yet someone invented this word magic hand and then said, look, the word magic hand means existing magician. Well, what I'm telling you is that no, of course there wouldn't actually be any magicians in that world. In that situation, it would be like we had invented a word which means existing magician. But there are no such things. Keep in mind, Alexandra and the others that are saying yes, that I began the example by stipulating that in this hypothesized counterfactual world, there are actually no magicians. So in that situation, not ours, in that situation, if a person had coined this phrase, that would not cause there to actually be any such magicians. So just based on a word which means existing magician, we cannot conclude that there actually are existing magicians. Let me give you another example that maybe makes it a bit simpler and less weird having to think about a hypothetical different universe. Well, it's still hypothetical, but tied to our own. Suppose that like tomorrow, there's no more magicians. Maybe they all get killed, maybe they all just die. But suppose that all the people that are doing their magic tricks and stuff as of today, they just don't exist tomorrow or in a few days. After they don't exist anymore, what if we still have this word? Would that bring them back? Would it mean that they have to exist because we still have this word? We still have this made-up word, which means existing magician. Of course not. So the word itself has no effect on whether or not magicians exist in reality. So what he's saying is it's kind of like the same with the word God, right? He grants that Anselm's definition of God, and maybe everyone's definition of God, is the existing perfect being, you know? But just because God's definition includes existence, we may be in a world where there is no God despite the word and despite what it means. Okay, so what he's saying is, even if God by definition means existing, that's just a definition and a word. The real question is, does the world have such things in it as the word defines? Now, his example, I'll tell you, is a little strange, and it's at least initially, maybe hopefully not anymore, but initially it's a little confusing because after all, there are magicians in our world. And so you could have been, I could understand you sitting and scratching your head and being like, but what does he mean? Like, there are magicians. The point is not that there actually are, but that there did not have to be just because this word was created, right? So like, there may be, there may not, but the word itself doesn't affect any of that at all. Okay, so with God, same thing. Maybe there's a God, maybe there's not. But just by saying the word God means by definition that he exists is not enough proof. It's no more or less proof than inventing this word and then saying, I've proven that magicians have to exist, right? Now, there is a second example about this whole argument of his that I think makes it even easier to understand. It's something that I kind of came up with that I think is a little easier, but I don't want to rush it with the last 2 minutes, but I'll give you a little preview. Suppose I invent this word unican, right? And I say to you that unican means, what do you think I'm going to tell you it means? Based on the word and how it sounds, and based on the stuff on the board. A unican, I tell you, just making it up, it's a unicorn, but what kind? The unican, slightly different spelling than unicorn. Unican is by definition a what? Existing unicorn. Good, Haley and Ronald and others. It's an existing unicorn, so I've made up a word unican. But are there any unicorns that really exist? Come on, we know that that answer is no. These are mythical creatures. So despite the fact that I invent the word unican, and I say its definition is existing unicorn, that is powerless to change the circumstances of reality, which is that there's no such thing. So with God, it's kind of like he says, in the usage of Anselm, the word God is used in the way that the author is using magican, or that I'm using unican. I can stipulate that in the definition itself, existence is a part of that meaning of that word. But if there really is no such thing, then it's just a word, regardless of whether it's defined as existing or not. Okay? So that's about it, I guess. We covered a good amount of material today. What we did was we summarized the Anselm ontological argument, and we continued and presented 3 objections to it. The objection of Gaunilo, the objection of G.E. Moore, and now the objection of William Rowe. And next class, we're going to start to talk about new arguments for God's existence. Some of them I find, in my judgment, are even better than the ontological argument. In fact, the next one we'll talk about would be if I was the one judging, what I judge to be probably the best high-quality argument for God's existence. So more persuasive to me, but everyone's got their own views. So we'll learn about it on Thursday. For now, though, we've run out of time, so I hope you guys are going to have a good night. Good luck with everything else until Thursday. I have office hours tomorrow like I always do Monday and Wednesday. I'll send the link for Zoom for those that want to come by if they do. If not, that's also fine. But anyways, until Thursday at 5:30, I'll see you guys then. Great. Thanks again, everyone. Take care. Stay healthy. And I'll definitely see you guys back. All right? Take it easy. Thanks.